Hi, that's Kirk, the bariatric carnivore. Well, yeah, have you noticed that there's not a lot of middle ground when it comes to food? The problem is most people just don't think about it, ever. I mean, I can have a lot of respect for people that are ethical vegans, people that have chosen that lifestyle because they do think it's better for them or for their health or something like that. I have no problem with people that make conscious health decisions, as long as they stay out of my face and don't tell me that I'm a bad person because I like to eat meat. We're cool. And people that are actually thoughtful about it, no matter what their health choices are, I'm frankly okay with that, because what they're not doing for the most part is, like, unfortunately, the majority of Americans. And the majority of Americans pretty much follow the government recommendation and just kind of mindlessly eat what big food and the government kind of pushes on them. And that's not good. That's the part that will get you in serious trouble. And if you might be thinking, well, really, come on, the federal government cannot inflict food guidelines on us, but unfortunately they do on a lot of people. Majority of our children, about 29 million kids every day, for breakfast and lunch, their food decisions are being made by the federal government and the food guidelines. 2 million members of the military, their decisions for food has been made by the federal food guidelines. People that are in the prison system have to follow the federal food guidelines. And a lot of senior citizens that are in nursing homes that are funded by federal food guidelines. People that are getting Meals on Wheels and other stuff like that, if they're receiving federal funds, they have to follow the federal government guidelines. So those have a lot of impact on a lot of people, and those are people that cannot make a decision themselves. Those are inflicted on them by the federal government. Now, when I say there's no middle ground on this stuff, here's the real problem with the federal government and their food guidelines. There's no science behind this stuff. And I want you to realize that. The food guidelines, the whole thing started in 1968 when a very liberal senator from South Dakota, George McGovern, decided that he wanted to create a standard diet. And the reason why is because the federal government was starting to purchase more meals for more people, and they were just buying stuff. They were just giving money, but there was no guidelines as to what they were buying. So he's like, we need to come up with federal food guidelines, and decided that we'll just get all the best experts we can, and we'll create a consensus of what is good, healthy diet. And he got all the scientists together, and for a decade, they screamed at each other. And at the end of it, most of the scientists said, look, Senator, there's no consensus. And his response was, well, we've got to decide something. Typical government. So a politician, he did not want to admit that there was no consensus, so he gave it to his chief of staff, who happened to be a vegetarian. And back in 1977, vegetarians were pretty rare and pretty radical. And, this is the guy, here's the guy, a liberal U.S. senator from South Dakota. His chief of staff basically drafted the food guidelines based on his decisions. And then they went over to the USDA, which is, the Department of Agriculture, and they created, then the industry lobbyists started getting involved, and we created guidelines not based on the best science, but based on politics and the bottom line profits of big food and the commodities that the Department of Agriculture was supporting, because part of their mandate under Congress is not to attack commodities that they subsidize. And what do they subsidize? Well, they're subsidizing corn and wheat, soybeans, stuff like that. So that's what was promoted from our federal government. And you're not looking, and if you ever look up corporate capture, that's the people that are up there whenever they have their big scientific consensus, where they have the food guideline people. They meet every 5 years. And if you look at who makes that up, you're going to look, and you look at their resumes, they're all part of big food and big pharma. Those are the people that are making these recommendations for the food. And Americans are following them. I mean, frankly, most Americans eat predominantly plant-based diets. I mean, mostly made up of corn, wheat, and stuff like that, but they're all plant-based. We hardly eat any beef, very few eggs. A very small percentage of the people eat the majority of the beef in this country. I frankly think probably the healthiest people. I mean, look, 10 to 12% of America is metabolically healthy. The majority of Americans who are eating basically what the government's recommending or getting the majority of their calories from what big food is pushing, which are basically the same thing. And majority of Americans right now are overweight, pre-diabetic, or full-scale type 2 diabetics. And a pre-diabetic is basically type 2 diabetic that hasn't crossed over a threshold. They're still getting all the damage that is happening to a type 2 diabetic. I was pre-diabetic and getting all the damage in the back of my eye. I was starting to go blind because of all the macular degeneration that was going on. And I wasn't even officially type 2 diabetic yet. That's the damage that happens when you're eating an improper diet. So we need to have this discussion, I think, as a nation, because there's no middle ground. There probably is a proper diet, and people need to figure it out for themselves, because what the federal government is pushing and what big food is pushing isn't obviously working, or we would not be in the horrible shape that we're in. And this is going to be a very expensive proposition as we get down the road, because we're rapidly, the healthcare cost is, we're talking in the trillions of dollars. I mean, just the care of type 2 diabetics is projecting into about $1 trillion a year. We're a nation that's $34 trillion in debt. And, now, when we have to double the amount that's going to cost, and then you've got drugs like Ozempic, which would cost us another $1 trillion if we gave it to all the people that were obese right now. The costs are astronomical. I mean, it costs $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year to give Ozempic treatments. And if the majority of Americans are overweight, do the math. Figure out how much that would cost. It would be ridiculously expensive. I mean, North Carolina tried to give Ozempic to people on welfare, and they had to cancel the program because it was bankrupting the state. And the federal government could probably do the same thing if they wanted to, and it's going to bankrupt the federal government. That's where we are as a country, because we're not paying attention to diet. And if you don't think diet's important, I mean, keep in mind, diet has always been the first line therapeutic before we came up with pharmaceuticals. The treatment for epilepsy for kids, the reason why we have a keto diet was because somebody figured out, this high-fat, low-carb diet, when you present it correctly as a therapeutic, you can cure a kid of horrible epileptic seizures. Low-carb diets was the treatment of choice for type 1, type 2 diabetics for most of the time before insulin was discovered. This has been, we've been using it as a cure for a lot of things, and we tend, I think probably part of the problem is, we tend to think of diet as only a means of losing weight, and that's not truly what diet is. Diet is what we eat. And I find it fascinating that we know what's the best diet for hogs, for chickens, for our cattle, for our pets. We can figure that out. Animal husbandry is really good at it. But we can't figure out what to eat for ourselves. That's idiotic. It's knowable. But it requires courage. It requires a lot of us to get out of our comfort zone. I remember what it was like when I first discovered low carb, when I first heard Dr. Stephen Phinney talking about it, and started really researching it for months, and made a commitment that, yes, I'm going to go low carb, and threw out all the processed food and all the vegetable oils and restocked with everything that I wanted for my new keto diet. And I looked at everything on the counter and realized, oh my God, this is the exact opposite of what the federal government's been telling me. It's like turning the food pyramid upside down. And I almost got into a cold sweat looking at it going, oh my God, I'm either going to die or I'm going to get really healthy. And I didn't know which. I mean, I was either going to have a heart attack in 2 weeks or I was going to get very healthy, and I wasn't sure. Thankfully, I got much healthier, got off all my meds, the eyes cleared up. I became, frankly, a much healthier human being, and all because of a dietary shift. So good food is good medicine. Bad food requires medicine. And you got to realize that it's that important of a decision. It can utterly change your life. There's no middle ground on this. Either the government and all those guidelines are correct, or the low carb community is, or the vegans are. Somebody is correct. It's knowable information. And the only person that can figure that out is you. You're it. Because if you turn that decision over to the government, if you turn it over to the media, if you turn it over to big food, keep in mind, those are all people that are working against your interest. They have no desire to make you healthy. The only person that really cares about your health at the end of the day is you. You're it. You've got to make that decision. And I hope you do. Not turn it over to other people. This is Kirk, the Bariatric Carnivore. I try to put out a couple messages each week. I hope you appreciate this message. If you do, please give it a like, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, join with other like-minded people, put comments down below. That helps get the algorithm to spread this message to other people that need it. And people do need it, because frankly, we are getting way too sick, and we need to start making conscious decisions about our diet and not have them inflicted upon us by other forces. I will talk to you again soon.